After the outset of the Battle of the Bulge, multiple German divisions comprising the various elements of the 47th Panzer Corps pushed across northern Luxembourg, and as they crossed first the Our River into Luxembourg, and then they ultimately drove out of Luxembourg into southern Belgium, they very quickly encircled a town called Bastogne. This is now one of the most memorable moments of the Battle of the Bulge, where these multiple German divisions surrounded the city which included a perimeter, and inside of which were about 10,000 U.S. Army soldiers. Those U.S. Army soldiers were from the 9th Armored Division, the 10th Armored Division, the 101st Airborne Division, and several attached battalions.
Bastogne, in many ways, can be compared to Gettysburg. The reason that it was needed by the Germans, it was a road intersection that if you can control that intersection, then you can control all the roads leading into and out of it. And for that reason, the really storied defense of it by the 101st Airborne really goes into the annals of American history.
There's an old saying that came up from the news: the Germans have the 101st surrounded, the poor bastards. It wasn't the battling bastards of Bastogne, as they would come to be known. It wasn't the sympathy for the 101st that was due. It was sympathy for the Germans that thought they had them surrounded. Any 101st, any screaming eagle worth his combat patch will be very quick to tell you the 101st had things quite in hand.
When the 101st Airborne received movement orders to go to Bastogne, the most senior officer present was Tony McAuliffe. He was the divisional artillery commander. So typically not a guy you think of as commanding a divisional sized force. When they moved into Bastogne, there were already Americans there, armored infantrymen, but in particular tank destroyers and tanks. Tony McAuliffe took command of them all.
The center of the city of Bastogne is called McAuliffe Square. It's named after this man, General Tony McAuliffe, who was the artillery commander for the 101st Airborne Division at the time of the Battle of the Bulge. During the siege of the city, the Germans sent a note through the lines demanding the surrender of the Americans inside the perimeter. When that surrender demand was presented to this man, Tony McAuliffe, he replied by saying, "Nuts." The response, "nuts," became sort of a metaphor representing the determined American spirit that resisted through the 7 days of siege here in the city of Bastogne.
The heroic stand of the 101st and the other troops in Bastogne allowed other American units to get into the fight. Units led by the likes of George S. Patton.
At the moment when that relief column reached the city and moved up to that square and reached that critical crossroads that is now known as McAuliffe Square, it signified something momentous, because the Battle of the Bulge was a battle that the United States did not have any preparation for. We didn't know what was going to happen. It wasn't like D-Day. It wasn't like something that we could rehearse endlessly before it actually happened. It was a surprise for the most part. And the American fighting spirit that we ultimately know so well, that we associate so famously with the way that the Second World War ended, you see it shining here in this one example, with the valiant defense of the city of Bastogne, preventing those critical roads from falling into the hands of the enemy. And by doing so, we prevented the enemy from moving west toward the Meuse River.
After the break, the siege of Bastogne is completely lifted as American troops converge at Houffles. Want to know what's happening at American Rifleman? Follow us on Twitter and like us on Facebook. We'll be right back.
With thousands of armored vehicles like the Panther participating in the Battle of the Bulge, they overwhelmed American forces at the outset of the Battle of the Bulge, but eventually American forces began to fight back. And in fact, as they fought back, the northern and southern forces ultimately joined here at Houffles on January 15th, marking an important moment, a turning point in the Battle of the Bulge. In the end, shortly before New Year's, American units stabilized the situation. The Germans had penetrated deep into our lines, and we managed to stop them at critical points. So containing the Battle of the Bulge was something that was done, for the most part, before New Year's Day. However, the enemy still had driven a wedge deep into our lines, and the enemy needed to be pushed back and pushed out of all of this territory that we had already liberated, that then we ended up having to give up to the enemy. And the way that we did that was that we had divisions that pushed from the south, pushing out of Luxembourg into that wedge, and we had divisions that pushed from the north, pushing south. And with those two pincers pushing toward each other, they would ultimately meet. And the point that they ultimately met on January 15th, 1945, was the city of Uffalise. And so in many ways, the city represents the hope of the Battle of the Bulge, the hope of overcoming the intense adversity of this battle, of this force of 250,000 Germans that ripped into the American military late in the war in a battle that was largely a surprise. This battle that called on all of the strength of the American fighting man. This battle that pitted all of our weapons, the best of ours, against the best of theirs.
The German surprise attack at the Battle of the Bulge really crumbled the American line. And in retrospect, you look at the Americans' ability to blunt, stop, and then drive back the German forces. You really have to thank the genius of John Moses Browning. Without the Model 1917 A1 heavy machine gun, the Model 1919 A4 and A6 light machine gun, and the Browning automatic rifle, it's really questionable whether we would have been able to prevail.
His designs had enormous influence on the capability of American troops to field competent, sturdy, reliable weapons that we didn't have to fuss with a lot. And as for John Garand, the best compliment I think he was ever paid was from Mikhail Kalashnikov. Kalashnikov was asked who he thought was the greatest gun designer, and he responded, John Garand. And his questioner asked him, well, why not John Browning? And Kalashnikov's answer was, as a designer, you only have to get everything right once to be great. And Garand got everything right. And that gun certainly was not perfect. No gun ever is. But it met the needs. It was the best infantry rifle of World War II, bar none. Nobody had a better rifle, either at the beginning or at the end. And it did everything that was expected of it.
Every infantry arm used by American soldiers was used in that battle. Included in that are the submachine guns. The principal submachine gun for most of the war was the Thompson in various iterations. You have the 28A1, you have the M1, and then the M1A1. But also you have the M3 grease gun, and the M3, as built by Guide Lamp of General Motors, was actually a very effective gun. It didn't look like much. They called it a grease gun because it looks like a grease gun, not a submachine gun. And the thing about a submachine gun is it gives you short-range firepower. You don't necessarily want a submachine gun in a 600-yard rifle fight, but if it's close confines where you can't see 40 yards because of all the trees, or in an urban environment, that's when you want a submachine gun. The Battle of the Bulge was really Hitler's last desperate gamble to win the war. American GIs, men armed with a Browning automatic rifle, M1 Garands, carbines, tanks, artillery, they put a stop to Hitler's ambitions and ended unspeakable evil. From December 16, 1944 until January 25, 1945, the U.S. Army fought its largest land battle, and 20,000 Americans were killed in that battle. While the American Rifleman crew was in Belgium, we were fortunate enough to actually meet with some veterans, Americans who fought in the Battle of the Bulge. Sadly, next year, there will be even fewer of them left.
My name is Frank Towers, and I served with the 30th Infantry Division, Company M, 120th Regiment.
Okay, I was PFC.
I entered the Battle of Bulge on the 15th of January of '45.
I belong to the headquarters, 1st Battalion, 117th Infantry, 30th Infantry Division.
It was in a light machine gun squad in the weapons platoon, Company G, 2nd Battalion, 347th Infantry Regiment, 87th Division.
We, with the gun, was the only thing between those guys and the ovens. People here don't know how far those Nazis went. That's just part of it. I've seen things that I won't tell you.